Hey folks, today we're going to cut through all the noise about Russia's economy since the Ukraine invasion. Don't worry if you've never taken an economics class, I'm going to break this down super simple. By the end of this video, you'll understand what's really happening with Russia's economy, without all the confusing jargon and headache-inducing charts. So here's something that might surprise you. Russia's economy has been growing faster than both the United States and Europe since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Russian supporters point to this and say, see, Western sanctions didn't work. But hold on, there's a big difference between wartime growth and real, healthy economic growth. Let me explain. Imagine if I told you that I spent my entire savings buying thousands of paper airplanes, then immediately set them all on fire. Did I generate economic activity? Sure, the paper airplane company made money, their employees got paid, and all that spending shows up in GDP numbers. But did I actually create anything valuable or sustainable? Absolutely not. That's essentially what's happening in Russia right now. When Russia spends $1 billion on tanks that get destroyed the next day in Ukraine, that $1 billion still counts as economic growth in the GDP statistics, even though nothing of lasting value was created. Pretty wild, right? Quick refresher. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. It's the total value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders. It's usually used as a scorecard for a country's economic health. But here's the problem. GDP doesn't distinguish between productive spending, like building schools or developing new technologies, and wasteful spending, like weapons that get destroyed. It all counts the same. Russia's defense spending jumped from about 3% of GDP before the war to nearly 7% after the invasion, and that's just the official military budget. War costs spill into healthcare, treating wounded soldiers, housing, rebuilding damaged areas, and infrastructure, building new supply routes to China and India to replace Western trade. In total, war-related spending in Russia went from roughly 23% of the government's budget before the invasion to almost 40% last year. The government is essentially pumping massive amounts of money into the economy without creating anything of lasting value. Economists call this helicopter money. It's like dropping cash from helicopters. And when you have more cash chasing the same amount of goods, you get Russia's inflation has been sky-high. In March, consumer prices were up 10.3% from the previous year, way above the central bank's target of 4%. Food prices have gone completely nuts. Fruit and vegetables up over 20%, potato prices nearly doubled, and butter prices jumping 26%. Things got so bad that stores started keeping butter in locked plastic boxes, like it was some kind of luxury item. Can you imagine having to ask a store clerk to unlock a case just so you can buy some butter? The Russian central bank has been fighting this inflation with interest rates at a jaw-dropping 21%. For comparison, American consumers were freaking out when our rates hit 5%. So what's causing all this inflation? One major factor is Russia's severe labor shortage. Between soldiers dying on the battlefield, young men being drafted, and Russians fleeing the country to avoid conscription, Russia simply doesn't have enough workers. This has pushed unemployment down to about 2%, the lowest ever recorded in Russia. That might sound good, but it's actually a sign of an economy in trouble. Here's why. The military sector is competing with civilian businesses for workers. To attract soldiers, the Russian government boosted military pay to 5 times the average Russian income. Civilian businesses had to raise wages too, just to keep their workers from enlisting. These higher wages drive up costs for businesses, which then raise prices on their products, creating a vicious inflationary cycle. In economics, there's a classic concept called guns versus butter. It describes the trade-off between military spending, see guns, and civilian goods, butter. Russia is now heavily favoring guns over butter. The military is getting all the resources, workers, and government attention, while civilian sectors suffer. This leads to some pretty bizarre economic distortions. For For example, the government launched a Mortgages for Everyone program offering loans at half the normal interest rate. Why? To keep citizens happy despite all the economic pain from the war. The result was a 35% growth in mortgage debt in just 1 year, creating a housing bubble in the middle of a war. You might be wondering, how is Russia affording all this? First, Russia still makes billions from oil and gas exports. They're the world's third largest oil producer behind the US and Saudi Arabia. When Western countries imposed sanctions, Russia simply shifted its oil sales to countries like China and India. Get this? Before the war, India bought just 1% of its oil from Russia. Now, they're buying 35 to 40% of their oil from Russia. That's a massive shift. Second, Russia's government spent down its sovereign wealth fund, essentially its national savings account. Third, they've let government services deteriorate in real terms. While military and police wages remain high, gotta keep the leadership protected, other government workers and pensioners have seen their real incomes decline. And fourth, they've announced tax hikes and spending cuts on things like education, healthcare, and small business support. Here's where things get really interesting. Putin has basically commandeered Russia's banking system, forcing banks to give preferential loans to companies he favors, especially defense contractors. This is essentially hidden money printing. Instead of the government directly printing money, which would be too obvious, they're forcing banks to create credit out of thin air and lend it to specific companies at below-market rates. The result? Russian corporate debt has soared by 71% since 2022. Many economists believe these loans will eventually default, potentially requiring a massive government bailout of the banking system. While Russia might appear to be weathering Western sanctions in the short term, the long-term outlook is bleak. The biggest problem is that Russia has been cut off from new technology, investment, and ideas from the rest of the world. Russian businesses face little competition, so they have no incentive to innovate or improve. Meanwhile, the rest of the world keeps moving forward. The longer this war continues, the more Russia stands still while global competitors advance. Remember, wartime economic growth isn't sustainable. When the war eventually ends, Russia will face a painful adjustment. Defense spending will drop, and all those workers in munitions factories will need new jobs. But unlike after most wars, there won't be much reconstruction needed inside Russia itself, since the fighting has been in Ukraine. Even before the war, Russia suffered from what economists call Dutch disease, named after what happened when the Netherlands discovered huge natural gas reserves in the 1960s. Here's how it works. When a country gets rich from natural resources, its currency strengthens. That makes imported goods cheaper, but makes it harder for domestic manufacturers to export their products. Over time, the economy becomes overly dependent on resource exports. That's exactly what happened to Russia. Instead of using its oil and gas wealth to build a diverse, high-tech economy, Russia doubled down on energy exports and energy-intensive industries. This actually made the transition to a wartime economy easier for Russia than it would have been for a more advanced economy. It's simpler to shift from pumping oil to building tanks than it is to convert, say, a semiconductor factory to military production, but this same factor will make it much harder for Russia to return to normal after the war. They've hollowed out what little productive capacity they had before, and their isolation has prevented them from keeping up with global innovation. Things have been getting worse for Russia's economy lately. Oil prices have fallen, and China's economy, Russia's biggest export destination, has slowed down. In March, Russian oil and gas tax revenue fell by about 17% compared to the previous year. The Russian Finance Ministry recently increased its budget deficit estimate for 2025 to 1.7% of GDP, more than triple the previous estimate. The International Monetary Fund expects Russia's economy to grow just 1.3% this year and 1.2% next year, a far cry from the impressive wartime growth rates we saw right after the invasion. So what's the takeaway? Russia's economic success during the war is largely an illusion. Yes, their GDP numbers look good on paper, but dig a little deeper, and you'll see an economy distorted by massive government spending, high inflation, labor shortages, and mounting debt. Putin has essentially mortgaged Russia's economic future to fund his war in Ukraine. Like someone maxing out credit cards to maintain a lavish lifestyle, it might look impressive from the outside for a while, but eventually, the bills come due. The Russian people are already feeling the pain through high inflation and shortages of basic goods. And the longer the war continues, the more Russia falls behind the rest of the world, technologically and economically. When you see headlines about Russia's economy defying sanctions, remember this: things aren't always what they seem. Sometimes what looks like strength is actually just smoke and mirrors. Thanks for watching. If you found this explanation helpful, hit that like button and subscribe for more straightforward breakdowns of complex economic topics. And let me know in the comments if there are other economic issues you'd like me to explain. See you next time.